Okay, so have you ever tried to actually define what tall means? Like where's the cutoff, right? Is someone who's 5'11" tall? What about 6 feet? Like where's the actual line?
Right. It's funny how these like really simple words can trip us up. It's like you
Yeah.
try to grab onto them and they just kind of slip through your fingers.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're going to dive into today. The whole slippery world of vagueness.
I'm really excited to unpack this stuff because it's not just about words, it's about how we think, how we make sense of the world.
Yeah.
And as the learner, you always bring the most interesting stuff to the table, so I know this is going to be
No,
good.
you definitely brought some great material this time. I mean, Cuts and Clouds by Dietz and Moruzzi, that's a classic.
Oh, yeah. And Roy Sorensen's Vagueness and Contradiction, that was a mind bender for sure.
And we've got Nicholas Smith's Vagueness and Degrees of Truth, Andrew Bacon's Vagueness and Thought, and Stewart Shapiro's Vagueness and Context.
It's like a whole buffet of vagueness.
Yeah.
And we're going to try to give you like the best bites from each one. So the learner, get ready for a deep dive into a topic that's both surprisingly deep and, kind of fuzzy at the same time.
So how do we even pin down vagueness? I mean, it's vague by definition, right? So where do we start?
Well, one place to start is with those like in-between cases. The ones that make you go, huh, is that really I? Like you were saying with tall. There are definitely some tall people
Mm.
and definitely some short people.
Right. But what about those right in the middle?
Exactly. Those are the borderline cases. Like
Yeah.
is someone 5'9" tall? It depends who you ask, right? There's no clear-cut answer. And that's a hallmark of vagueness.
And this leads us right to the Sorites paradox, which is like a recurring guest star in all our readings.
Oh, yeah. The Sorites is a classic.
Yeah.
And it shows us just how slippery vagueness can be. So the typical example is with a heap of sand. You got like 10,000 grains of sand. That's definitely a heap.
Okay, sure.
Now, take away one grain. Is it still a heap? Probably right. It still looks like a heap.
I guess so.
But keep doing that, one grain at a time. Eventually, you'll just have one grain left. And no one would call that a heap.
So at what point does it stop being a heap?
That's the paradox. Each step seems tiny and insignificant. But all those tiny steps lead to a conclusion that feels totally absurd. And this happens because there's no sharp boundary for heap. It's like trying to find the exact moment a color fades into another. It's a gradual shift, not a sudden switch.
So the lack of a sharp boundary is what our sources call boundarylessness, right?
Yeah, and that's a key feature of vagueness. But there's more to it than that. Remember Dietz and Moruzzi's example with small for apartments?
Remind me about that one.
Okay, so they imagine this adjective small that we only understand by like knowing which sentences using it are okay. Without any specific size criteria. So, this apartment is small, might be acceptable. But a house with 10 bedrooms is small is clearly wrong. But there's no exact square footage that defines small.
Right, so it's boundaryless.
Yeah, but here's the thing. You don't get that same Sorites problem with small. You can't gradually add or subtract a tiny bit of space and turn a clearly small apartment into a clearly not small one. So boundarylessness is important. But it's not the whole story. There's also this idea that tiny changes shouldn't matter. But they eventually do add up.
It's like a logic puzzle that breaks its own rules. Now let's get to the million-dollar question. Where does vagueness even come from? Is it in our language? Or is the world itself somehow vague?
That's the big debate, right?
Yeah.
There's the vagueness in language camp. They say the world itself is precise and sharp, but our language is messy and imprecise.
Right.
Like we're trying to describe a perfect circle using clunky words.
So the fuzziness is in our words, not in the world itself.
Exactly. Now the other camp, the vagueness in the world folks, they say the world itself is fuzzy, and our language is just reflecting that. Like maybe there are actually fuzzy objects and properties out there, and our language is just trying to keep up.
Whoa, that's like saying reality itself is blurry.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild idea.
Yeah.
And then you've got folks like Smith who talk about semantic realism and model theory.
How does that fit in?
Well, Smith basically says we could take our models of language super seriously. If our best models for vagueness say there are degrees of truth or indeterminate states, then maybe that reflects something real about the world. Maybe reality isn't as black and white as we think.
So our theories about language could actually tell us something about the nature of reality itself.
Exactly. It's like our models are giving us a glimpse behind the curtain. Now, to tackle some of these paradoxes and problems head on, we need to bring in some heavy hitters, like degrees of truth and fuzzy logic.
Okay, break those down for me.
So classical logic says everything is either true or false, right? But fuzzy logic throws that out the window. It says, hey, there are shades of truth. You can have something that's kind of true or mostly false or anything in between.
So instead of just true and false, it's like a whole spectrum.
Exactly. And instead of just using 0 for false and 1 for true fuzzy logic, uses numbers between 0 and 1 to represent those degrees of truth. And this helps us deal with the Stewart paradox.
How so?
Remember how each step in that heap argument seems kind of true? But the final conclusion is obviously false.
Yeah.
Well, fuzzy logic says each step might have a high degree of truth, like 0.99, but it's not perfectly true. And those tiny drops in truth add up. As you take away more and more grains, the truth value keeps going down until you get to 1 grain. And then the statement 1 grain is a heap has a truth value super close to 0. So it's basically false.
So it's not that any one step is like totally wrong. It's just that the truthiness fades away as you go.
Exactly. And this whole idea is built on fuzzy sets, which are like regular sets but with a twist.
Okay, what's the twist?
So in a regular set, something is either in the set or it's not. Like the set of all even numbers. A number is either even or it's odd.
Next.
But in a fuzzy set, things can be members to a certain degree. So you could have the fuzzy set of tall people, and someone who's 5'10" might be in that set to a degree of like 0.8.
So they're like mostly tall.
Exactly. And this lets us model vagueness in a more nuanced way. Another big theory is supervaluationism.
Oh, okay. What's the deal with that one?
The supervaluationism says, look, there are lots of ways to make a vague term precise. Like with bald. You could say anyone with fewer than 100 hairs is bald. Or you could say anyone with fewer than 50 hairs is bald. And both of those are kind of reasonable, right?
I guess so.
Supervaluationism says a statement is super true if it's true under all those different ways of making the vague terms precise. So if it's true no matter how you sharpen up the meaning, then it's super true.
So it's like finding the common ground between all the different ways to interpret a vague term.
Exactly. And this helps us with the Stewart paradox. Because the inductive step that says if n grains is a heap, then n minus 1 grains is a heap, well, that's not super true. Because no matter how you define heap, there's going to be some number of grains where it stops being a heap. And at that point, the statement, if that number is a heap, then 1 less is a heap. Well, that's just false. So the whole inductive step breaks down and the paradox dissolves.
I see. So by looking at all the possible interpretations, we can avoid getting trapped in that slippery slope.
Precisely. Now, there are other nuances, too, like how supervaluationism deals with identity statements involving vague terms.
Okay, what's the issue there?
Well, let's say you've got a statement like, Everest is the tallest mountain in the world.
Right.
Now, Everest and the tallest mountain might refer to slightly different precise peaks depending on how you define tallest. Like maybe you include snow on the top or maybe you don't.
Get it.
But the statement still seems true, right?
Okay.
And to explain this, Keefe talks about penumbral connections. It's like different ways of making the terms precise might pick out slightly different peaks, but they're all still kind of related. They're in the same conceptual family, so the identity still holds.
So it's like a family resemblance, even if the individual members aren't perfectly identical.
Exactly. It's a pretty neat way to deal with those tricky cases. Now let's switch gears to epistemicism.
Which sounds like it's about knowledge.
It is, and it's a pretty radical view. Epistemicism says vague terms actually do have precise boundaries, but we just don't know where they are. It's like there's a secret line in the sand, but we're blindfolded.
So it's saying there's a sharp cutoff for bald, but we just can't figure out the exact number of hairs.
Exactly. And this seems counterintuitive, right? If there's a precise line, why are we so clueless about it?
Yeah, it feels like a bit of a cop-out.
That's a common criticism. But epistemicists say our ignorance comes from how language works. They argue that even tiny variations in how we use language can lead to different precise meanings. So it's like we're always just slightly missing the mark.
So it's not that there's no precise meaning, it's that we can't quite pin it down.
Exactly. And Williamson even suggests these metalinguistic safety principles, which are like rules that prevent us from ever knowing those precise boundaries, for sure. Because if we try to get too specific, we risk being wrong due to those subtle shifts in meaning.
So it's like a built-in limit to our knowledge.
In a way, yeah. Now let's think about how vagueness messes with something as fundamental as logic. I mean, classical logic is all about things being either true or false, but vagueness throws a wrench in that.
Right, because with borderline cases, it's not always clear if something is true or false.
Exactly. And this has led some folks to develop alternative logics, like paraconsistent logic, which can handle contradictions without everything exploding, and three-valued logic, which adds a third truth value, like indeterminate.
So to really handle vagueness, we might need a whole new kind of logic.
Well, it depends on who you ask. Some folks like Smith argue that supervaluationism, even though it has a different way of defining truth, still basically preserves classical logic. But other theories that accept truth-value gaps, Those definitely lead to some deviations from classical logic.
So there's still debate about whether we need to rewrite the rulebook entirely. Now, what about this idea of higher order vagueness? That sounds like it's getting pretty meta.
Oh yeah, this is where things get really wild. Higher order vagueness means that the boundaries of vagueness itself are vague. So it's not just that we don't know if someone is bald, it's that we don't even know where the line is between definitely bald and borderline bald.
It's like trying to draw a fuzzy line around a cloud.
Exactly. And this can go on forever. You can have borderline cases of borderline cases and so on. It's like an infinite regress of fuzziness.
So how do we even deal with that?
Well, Rapia argues that even just the idea of higher-order borderline cases can lead to problems if you accept that there are no sharp cutoffs even at that level. And some theories, particularly the ones involving definiteness, suggest that if you allow for gradual transitions in a sorts-right series, you end up having to reject sharp boundaries even for the concept of definiteness itself. It's pretty mind-bending.
Yeah, my brain is starting to feel a bit fuzzy itself. Now let's shift focus to how vagueness affects our thoughts. I mean, we've been talking a lot about language, but what about what's going on inside our heads?
That's where Bacon's work comes in. He makes a distinction between sentential vagueness, which is vagueness in the sentences we use, and propositional vagueness, which is vagueness in the actual thoughts themselves.
So it's like the difference between a blurry picture and a blurry concept.
Exactly. And Bacon argues that only a theory that accepts propositional vagueness can really explain why we're sometimes ignorant about vague stuff. Because if vagueness is just in the language, then our ignorance should be tied to the specifics of how we're using language.
But that's not always the case, right? Sometimes we're just clueless about something because it's inherently vague.
Exactly. And that suggests the fuzziness might be in the ideas themselves, not just the words we use to label them.
So our thoughts themselves can be vague, not just our words.
Exactly. Now, this has some interesting implications for how we make decisions. Because often our goals and preferences are vague, like we want more happiness or a better life. But those are super vague.
Right. How do you even measure that?
Exactly. And Bacon suggests this idea of practical irrelevance, which says that maybe our preferences for those vague outcomes are actually less important than our preferences for the more concrete things that contribute to them.
So even if we say we want more happiness, our choices are probably based on or specific things we believe will lead to happiness.
Exactly. And there's a whole area of decision theory that tries to deal with vagueness using things like v-values, which are basically like assigning numbers to how much we value certain propositions. And then we can try to make choices that maximize our expected value, even when things are fuzzy.
It sounds like even when we're dealing with vague goals, there's still some underlying precision guiding our actions. Now, Shapiro looks at how context affects all this. How does the situation we're in change how we deal with vagueness?
Well, Shapiro talks about the open texture thesis, which basically says that in those borderline cases, it's okay for different people to disagree about whether a vague term applies. And they're not necessarily wrong.
So there's some wiggle room in how we apply vague terms.
Exactly. And Lewis talks about conversational score, which is like this idea that the context of a conversation can help us track and adjust for vagueness. Like if someone violates certain tolerance principles, meaning they say something that's way too far out of line with how we normally use a vague term, then their contribution might get challenged.
So it's like we're constantly calibrating our understanding of vague terms based on the context.
Exactly. And Shapiro emphasizes that vagueness might be judgment dependent, meaning how we apply a vague term really depends on our judgments in a specific situation. Like what counts as tall in a room full of basketball players is going to be different than what counts as tall in a kindergarten class.
That makes perfect sense. Now, Smith also briefly mentioned this thing called the innocent criterion related to color perception.
Oh yeah, that's a fascinating one. The innocent criterion says that two colors are the same if and only if we can't visually tell them apart.
Okay.
But if we assume that this can't tell apart relationship is transitive, meaning if A looks the same as B and B looks the same as C, then A must look the same as C. Well, this seemingly innocent idea could actually lead to sharp cutoffs in the color spectrum.
Even though our perception of color seems smooth and continuous.
Exactly. It shows how our limited perception might be hiding a more precise underlying reality, and that even our seemingly vague experiences might be built on something more sharp and definite.
So even our senses might be tricking us into seeing vagueness, where there might be precision lurking beneath. Now, last but not least, we've got indeterminate identity.
Ah, yes. The philosophical brain teaser of whether a ship that's had all its parts replaced is still the same ship.
Right. So how does vagueness play into this?
Well, it messes with our understanding of what it means for something to be the same over time. When things change gradually, it can become unclear if they're still the same thing. And this raises some serious issues for classical logic.
Like what?
Well, there's this thing called Leibniz's law, which says that if two things are identical, they must have all the same properties.
Right.
But when you've got indeterminate identity, it gets tricky. Like if a ship has slowly had all its parts replaced, does it still have all the same properties as the original ship?
It's hard to say, right? It's kind of both the same and different.
Exactly. And this challenges some of our most basic logical assumptions. So some philosophers have suggested that maybe we need to rethink those assumptions when dealing with cases of indeterminate identity.
So vagueness might force us to rethink the very foundations of logic.
Potentially, yeah. It's a pretty wild thought.
Well, the learner, after this whirlwind tour of vagueness, how are you feeling about that initial example of tall or rich now?
You know what strikes me is how something so everyday and seemingly simple can lead to such deep philosophical puzzles. And how many different ways there are to try to make sense of it. It's like vagueness is this hidden complexity that's woven into the fabric of our language and maybe even reality itself.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating to see how all these different theories, fuzzy logic, supervaluationism, epistemicism, they all try to grapple with this complexity using completely different approaches. It shows you how much there still is to explore and understand, even about something as basic as a vague word.
And it's not just theoretical, the learner. Understanding vagueness can actually make you a sharper thinker and communicator.
Totally. Like in law, where the interpretation of vague terms can have huge consequences, or in AI, where we're trying to teach machines to understand the nuances of human language. And even in everyday life, being more aware of vagueness can help you avoid misunderstandings and communicate more clearly.
Exactly. So here's a final thought for you. The learner. If even seemingly clear-cut concepts can have fuzzy boundaries, what does that tell us about our ability to truly know and understand the world? And how can we use this awareness of vagueness to make better decisions and have more meaningful conversations?
It's definitely something to ponder. And maybe revisit those sources you shared with a fresh perspective. You might see them in a whole new light.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and often frustrating world of vagueness.
Until next time, keep those brains fuzzy and those thoughts sharp.
And embrace the ambiguity.